All right, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to another live classroom. And in this classroom, I kind of want to build upon previous classrooms, like I always do. Primarily, again, about just basic shape manipulation, and how it can help you better understand complex shapes. And this, of course, we're doing knights this week, but it shouldn't really matter. Like, this should just be a principle that could help you better understand complex shapes, internalize things that you see from reference, and kind of reinterpret it in any way that you want to, especially when drawing from imagination. I think one of the main issues a lot of you still struggle with is that you need to rely too much on reference. And what I mean by that is that um, it's not a taboo to use reference. It's actually necessary to use reference. But a lot of you copy the reference like one to one because you need to rely on what you see instead of, being able to manipulate what you see and actually use the useful things in your reference and kind of apply that to your own designs and unique designs, instead of being manipulated by what you see. So, I'm just gonna go over the step by steps that I'm having you guys do this week, just to kind of show you what I mean by them. I saw that some of you, Axel and Baloo, already did a great job at the part one assignments, so that's really good to see. At least then, I'm confident that it comes across. So I just briefly want to show you what I mean by it. And so for part one, what we're doing is we're taking primitives, like the first simple primitive that we all heard of, which is spheres, cylinders, cones, boxes. Not as much this week, but it can definitely help us. And what we're doing is we're wrapping objects around them, like they're part of the sphere, but we're basically doing almost like a cutout. But I think like it's easier for you to understand wrapping things around it. So, like I said, for instance, here with a sphere, the thing that we need to consider is at all times the contour of the sphere, right? So if we understand the contours on which we are drawing, we can have an easier time wrapping things around those objects because we know how to follow the contour. And not only that, we can also we also have a better spatial awareness. I think that's the main thing that I really want to stress this classroom is like good spatial awareness. And I feel like the exercises that I'm giving you this week should facilitate that. All right. So, when we wrap around, you're just basically going to take your primitives that you've drawn and you're going to try and wrap around some interesting but random shapes, right? Don't feel obligated to make this look super pretty. Just try to go for clear communication in what you do. So you can definitely do this with me if you want to, if you're on your desk. Right, so we're trying to create that spatial awareness by just wrapping objects around simple primitives. And if any of you guys have any questions for me, feel free to ask. And I will try and answer them. Yeah, you're all muted then, but you can just type it. I muted everyone just for the sake of me being able to explain things in the classrooms. It's different than the lounge sessions. So I feel like by doing this exercise, you should also just get a better understanding of contour lines in general, because I feel that's a big part of trying to come up with interesting designs, is trying to manipulate those contours as well. So when you can literally wrap your head around contours, you should have an easier time manipulating those contours and then wrapping these things around it again. And that's what I'll show you in the next exercise as well. I feel like my image is a little stretched, but also when you're doing these exercises, try to convey as much depth in the wrapping objects as you can. So what that means is, like, you could easily do this on this cone, right? And that would technically be accurate. this would lay on top of this primitive, but you're not really showing any depth, right? So try to really follow some contours and try to show some depth. And like, you should treat these primitives like they're see-through glass objects. So everything that you wrap around it should be visible on the other side. If you want to practice some of your design sense, you can try to go for interesting shapes and shapes that kind of complement each other, which usually gives like a nice design aesthetic. No, Ina. So I would highly discourage you from looking at reference right now, because it will only influence you and manipulate you to really draw the things that you're seeing. Like, I really want, like, that's why I'm telling you not to be concerned with drawing anything believable. Just draw organic shapes that wrap around these primitives. That's the objective of this exercise, just to get more spatial awareness. Is drawing lines on a screen tablet easier than non-screen? I've never tried a tablet with a screen. I'm curious about it. Well, I'd say it's probably easier. I don't really like the disconnection from tablet to screen. I like to just like on paper, I like to just draw on the surface that I want to draw and directly see the result. All right, so once you've done this exercise, you should do a lot of this. I prescribed a certain amount. Again, the amounts that I usually prescribe are the minimum. Feel free to do more. And if you feel like this is a challenging enough exercise this week, like solely focus on part 1 and part 2 of this week. Because I'm trying to just increase your spatial awareness first and foremost before becoming a good designer, right? So the more advanced artists of this week, they should strive to make a certain design this week. But again, increasing your spatial awareness is the most important. Right, and then the second part, or the second set of assignments for part 1 of this week is, again, contour manipulation. And I've talked about contour manipulation a lot. I also talked about it in Dragon Week, in the Dragon Classroom assignments, so be sure to check that out as well. I also talk a little bit about it in the Samurai Classroom, where, by the way, there's a handful of ways that you can interpret or you can distill the reference that you're looking at and break it down or break down the complex shapes. And what I'm showing you guys today is just one of them, right? I'm just trying to show you varying exercises that you can do because everyone's different and everyone solves problems differently. It's not like that's the difference between math and art. Math has a certain amount of formulas, art has many. But in the Samurai Classroom, I also show you probably the most commonly used ones when it comes to shape welding and just addition and subtraction. And now I'm just trying to show you a different approach that you could use. So with the contour manipulation, what you're basically going to try and do this week is first you're going to just try a straight cylinder. So for instance, if we have a straight cylinder, I'm just going to use some Procreate sheets. A straight cylinder like this. Right? What you're then going to do, because that contour of a cylinder is basically a circle, and what you're now going to do is you're going to change that contour to be something else, right? And that's the contour that you're then going to draw that resulting cylinder for. So it should completely change the look of your cylinder. Right, and again, these primitives shouldn't make any sense. Like, it's just focusing on the task at hand. It doesn't need to represent a chest plate, an armor, a pauldron, a gauntlet. It doesn't need to represent anything. You just need to focus on how do I manipulate the contour of the cylinder and what resulting shape does that give me, right? After that, so the advanced version of that is taking an already manipulated cylinder. For instance, we have, like I have here on the top, we have a medium-sized contour on the top. We have a bigger size contour in the middle, right? We're basically inflating this cylinder, so to speak, and then we have the same size at the bottom. Now what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the contours of each of these contours. So for instance, we're going to manipulate this contour, we're going to manipulate this contour, and maybe all the ones in between as well. And we're not going to do it, necessarily going to do it with the same shape. So it's a little bit of a kind of a really difficult thing to wrap your head around, especially in the beginning. But it's a really, really good exercise just for you to handle complex shapes. So, for instance, what you could do, we could leave the top one as is, but then we could manipulate the bigger one to be more like triangular, for instance. And the one beneath that could be even more triangular. And then we could see like what kind of resulting shape does the manipulation of these contours give us. Now, there can be many different contours in between, and the more of them that you draw, the clearer your resulting object will be, of course. Now, if you have some experience, you can just draw a handful of them and kind of figure out the rest. So that kind of depends on your level of experience. Right. And we could say like this is the resulting form because we've manipulated these contours, and this is what we end up with. And now the cool thing about this is that we can then use this manipulated form. Right, so I'm just gonna copy paste that. We can use this manipulated form and do the exact same exercise as we did before, like wrapping basically sheets around a primitive. But what we're doing now is we're wrapping those sheets around a manipulated primitive. So going back to this thing, we can now wrap things around this. Right? And see what we end up with. Right. And of course, this does represent some sort of chest plate. It very much could be. I did this on purpose. Now, like I said, the shapes that you're manipulating don't need to represent anything. I just wanted to make it clear for you guys what this type of exercise can do for you when you're applying these principles, right? So first go from just manipulating the contour straight across, and then try if you can manipulate that contour with varying sizes and varying shapes, and see what that resulting kind of form becomes. And then you can do that sheet exercise of wrapping things around that manipulating form, which really gives you some nice, or you can end up with some really complex shapes that actually started really simple. So what you're essentially doing is you're starting to think more like a 3D modeler instead of just drawing on a 2D surface. Am I making sense so far? Because I know I tend to just ramble on. Okay. Great. So then moving on. Right. What I then want you guys to do, of course, this is probably the main assignment for a lot of you this week, is I want you now to apply these principles to your references. So you're going to analyze the reference, try and visualize, okay, is there some wrapping around a basic primitive going on? Is the primitive being manipulated first? And how is that all fitting together? So that's exactly, Dan. It's also almost like Boolean actions. It's basically what I'm trying to explain here. So I'm just gonna do one of these because we're gonna, or maybe a couple. So if we look at this helmet, for instance, like, and this is what I see a lot of you struggle with a lot of the times. You instantly go for like the complex shape, like what is this made of? Or you make the common mistake of just copying what you see. Now it's easy to copy what you see because you can just recognize the silhouette, right? So it's easy to just go like, okay, we have something like this, that goes down like that, maybe even sticks out, goes like this, right? And you're basically just following the silhouette almost, but it doesn't really come from a place of understanding. And that's what I'm trying to teach you here, because once you understand exactly what you're looking at in its structural point of view, it becomes 10 times easier to then just rotate this thing in space and manipulate it as you see fit from any angle, making you a very effective designer or even illustrator, right? So again, this helmet could easily start off as like a sphere connected to another sphere, right? But then of course these contours, right, could have a manipulated triangle. So if we look at that from the top view, could have a manipulated triangle like this, right? And that could go all the way down. Right? And what would the resulting shape of that be? So then it would make more sense for this to actually look the way it does, the way we're seeing it in this reference. Right? And then that neck guard that he has that goes around your neck, it's basically also a sphere, and it's basically that wraparound sort of exercise that we were just doing. Right. So I'm doing this very crudely. I'm not trying to win any beauty contest here. But again, as you can see, this can sort of help me understand the shape itself a lot better, and then manipulate that shape in space as well, right? And even like the face guard itself that is movable, right? There's probably like a hinge point over here that allows you to open this thing up. I feel like it's lagging a little bit. Okay. So again, this is just the basic, that wrapping exercise, right? Where it's just going from this manipulated shape that we just made, and we're just wrapping around this thing like this, following the contour, ending up with our shape. Again, it's not perfect. It's a little bit more like this. So this is like one way to look at it, and manipulated contours is a little bit more complex. Usually what a lot of other artists might explain is that you could just regard it as a sphere with a triangular object attached, right? Which could also completely work. Now it depends on the situation and how you want to solve the problem at hand. And I find that usually with more organic shapes, and some of these night armors have pretty organic shapes, the contour manipulation works a lot better, and the wrapping around of primitives works a lot better than just slapping like manipulated primitives together. Now, of course, when it comes to figuring out things in perspective, it's a lot easier to just, do the addition method, where you just take a primitive, slap another one onto it, and then you can really see what's going on. But again, using a combination of those also really comes in handy. Right, so same for this gauntlet, right? It sometimes might look really daunting to look at this and think like, okay, what's really going on here? And that's what I see a lot of people struggle with. But again, if you just regard it as first that simple cylinder, that's a little bit tapered, right, towards the wrist, like this. And then we regard it as the top of that. So this top contour is being manipulated slightly, like super slightly. There's just a small addition of like this triangular shape. Right, and that kind of is continued throughout a little bit, and it kind of fades off towards the end, so it gives us a little bit more of a contour like this and a shape like this. Right, now that doesn't really make up the entirety of the gauntlet, because, and now we do that wrapping around exercise that I showed you in the first part, is that it also kind of, there's a slight tilt towards the upper part of this gauntlet. So we can wrap around it by cutting off from here and then meeting up with that contour like this. Right, and this is basically also just a wrapping exercise, wrapping around a manipulated primitive. Does that make sense? Good. Right, again, same for this one. For instance, if we look at the pauldrons, that's a really easy one. It's basically just a sphere that's almost attached to the shoulder, and that's what I'm going to show you later in the example. And then we're just wrapping around, that exercise that I showed you guys. right? And this should give you a much better idea of just spatial awareness. Like that's the most important thing that I want you to take away from this today. It's just having better spatial awareness and just thinking about primitives first. That's the important one. So I quickly made an example before this class. When it comes to then part 3 of this design assignment, right, for today, like I'm giving you guys the assignment to design a certain armor. Now, for the recreational part, it's just trying to recall the things that you studied in part 2. Try to recall it for part 3. Just study the helmets or a couple of helmets and then see if you can draw one without really using the primitives, or you can do an underdrawing if you want to, and see if you can recall it and just make it in any perspective that you want. Again, focusing on that spatial awareness. There doesn't need to be any cool design to it yet. It just needs to be a believable knight helmet, knight pauldron, gauntlet, whatever, chest plate, and just try to recall it from memory, right? This is really going to help you boost your internal library. It's going to be really handy later down the line when you do want to design things, right? Of course, for you hardcore athletes who have the assignment to draw a knight, you of course can look at reference, and this is what I've been talking about in the beginning of this classroom, is that too many of you are manipulated by the reference that you're looking at. So what does that mean? What I mean by that is, if you were to look at the reference that I have here, what I would see a lot of you guys do is just draw a character in the perspective of this reference, because you basically already have the 2D information to go off, instead of using this thing to your advantage and then just kind of projecting that onto a design of your own, perspective of your own, angle, pose, whatever, right? So you're basically just trying to understand the spatial awareness of the reference that you're looking at and projecting that onto your model. And so when you create a simple character like this, right, the simple mannequin, we don't need anatomy because it's a knight, right? Simple mannequin like this, I can look at the reference and like try to understand all the primitives and manipulated primitives that are going on in this picture, right? So that would kind of look like this. Right? There's some bent cylinders, bent spheres, some manipulated spheres, some things that, just help me attach other objects to those primitives. Just simple spheres that I'm going to use to wrap this around my object or my subject, right? And this is just the simple forms or manipulated forms that I'm thinking about, right? And then based on that, I can add in my armor, right? So I'm still using the reference that I'm looking at, everything from the visual information, but I just try to understand that visual information and then rotate it in space as I see fit, making me a much more effective designer than being manipulated by what you see. Now, one of the main arguments for this, and it's something that you shouldn't concern yourself with right now when you're studying, and I'm talking to most of the beginners in this classroom, some of you more advanced athletes, just do whatever you want, right? But a lot of you kind of fear that if you're doing this, your designs will look too stiff, right? Because it's basically you're working with very simple objects and then you're wrapping things around those simple objects, but in the beginning, don't worry about things looking stiff. Just worry about things looking correct and placing things in space as best as you can and making that look structurally believable. That's going to be much more important. You can break the rules later if you want to, As of right now, just focus on that structural awareness, because when you really understand this and you can play around with it, you can manipulate this in whatever way you want, right? And still have that structural awareness. And then you can really play with the shapes. You can play with the shape language, the exaggeration of shapes. You can even make it comical, but you still understand the structure underneath and the primitives that you're manipulating. So that's something that you can do later. You can stylize whatever you want. You can design. You can add in information. That's basically what a concept designer does, right? When we get a brief for a project and I need to design a knight, for instance, or I need to design a sci-fi character or a mech design, but it needs to represent a knight, right? I can still look at knight reference, internalize the shapes that I really like, project that onto my own design, manipulate it in whatever way I want to, and make it look believable and also resemblant of the reference that I was looking at, but not being manipulated by it. Just so it's not a one-on-one copy. It's my interpretation with some cool design language, with some cool whatever the art or the brief needs me to do. And I can basically have my own voice in that. And that's what you're trying to, or that's what you're striving to do, at least. So yeah, that's basically what I want you to focus on this week. And I think that's all I wanted to say. So if you guys have any further questions or things you wanted to ask, or things that weren't clear, or things I rushed over, just waiting if I'm going to see any questions pop up. Otherwise, this is going to be an easy classroom. Question: can learning 3D programs help me with spatial awareness? A resounding yes. Terrestrial. Yes, very much so. Just because being aware of the Y, X, and Z axes, so all the axes that you use in a 3D program, and like Dan said, booleans and things like just manipulating 3D shapes. By learning that in 3D, it will make you a much more effective problem solver in 2D as well. You wanted to see the primitives for Gato? Yeah, here you go. So we have the mannequin, like this. And I'm projecting those basic manipulated shapes on top of that. And to kind of run you through it, so the helmet is like just an elongated sphere with a simple cone attached to it. The blue cylinder that I'm showing you here is to illustrate how that neck guard basically wraps around your shoulder girdle, right? So it gives you an easier time to figure that out. Again, just basically simple bent cylinders on that mannequin to represent the pauldrons. A simple sphere for the elbow protection, a tapered cylinder for the gauntlets, a simple manipulated cylinder for the leg protection, again a sphere for the knee protection, and then the what's that called on the bottom on your, what's the shin protection called? It's got a name. Greaves, thank you. So, simple contour manipulation of a cylinder for the greaves. And then that can feed into, even in this just the same cylinder almost, right? But I am combining like a cylinder and a sphere to create this one piece of a greave. Should we make them 8 headstones? That doesn't matter, Dan. Just as long as they're structurally sound, the proportion at this point, again, the mannequin proportion, the figure simplification I talk about, 7 to 8 heads tall. Just strive for that in the beginning. Always strive for the ideal proportions in the beginning because you can cheat those proportions later. Did I miss a question or not? I'll show you guys the simple shapes again. Any tips on how to identify the basic volumes when multiple pieces overlap? What do you mean by multiple pieces overlapping? You mean on like a armor set, Parker? Yeah. Well, that's going to be your exercise this week when it comes to spatial awareness, and that's why I'm first having you draw simple shapes and those wraparounds of primitives, because that should give you the spatial awareness. If you look at an armor set and you recognize like, okay, this is basically a cylinder and there's a form wrapping around it, you should be able to figure out the things that you're not seeing, like the back, like the chest plate. It also has a back, right, to attach to the chest plate. You can basically almost make that up from imagination just by imagining the primitive that this chest plate occupies, right? So it's the tip is here, just do the exercises. That's the tip. All right, so for your assignment for lesson 4 on shape wrapping, what you're going to do is you're going to, again, 3 parts. In the first part, you are going to draw 20 primitive shapes and you're going to wrap random shapes around it, right? So you can still have an underdrawing of primitive shapes. And then you're going to wrap, on top of that with a different color, you're going to wrap shapes around it so that it appears as if they're following the topology of that primitive. But we need to be able to see through it. So, right, the primitive that you're drawing is essentially like made up of glass, and we need to see through whatever is wrapping around it. And then for part 2, you're going to do exactly the same, right? So you're going to again draw 20 of these wrapped primitives, but you're going to do it without an underdrawing, right? So you're going to figure out, you're going to imagine the primitive around which you are designing, and then you're going to freehand it as if there's nothing here, right? Oh, or there is nothing here, but you're imagining the primitive that exists within it, right? And then for part 3, what you're going to do is you're going to look up a reference that displays this sort of wrapping. Now, the best examples for this, especially if you're into fantasy, is armor, right? So if you look at armor, and you don't have to, again, design the complete thing, only just parts of it, like not even a complete helmet like this is necessary. But again, please do include your reference. If there's no reference in part 3, we cannot approve it, okay? So based on the reference that you use, we want to see 10 drawings that display some sort of this shape wrapping. Now, of course, it's not always going to be primitives, right? It's going to be a little bit more manipulated primitives or more complex shapes where the other like objects are wrapping around to. But still, we need to be able to see what it's wrapping around to. That needs to be clear, okay? So that's your assignment for for lesson 4 of this module, and these are the 3 parts that you need to do. All right, have fun, guys.